Swinson.
Thank you, Mrs. Dean. And first of all, I would just like to say how grateful I am to be able to introduce the debate this morning on this important topic, which is particularly timely given the WTO ministerial meeting scheduled next month for Hong Kong. I'm sure that honourable members here will agree that the international issues of poverty, aid, debt relief and trade justice have captured the imagination of the public in 2005. The high-profile Make Poverty History campaign has been successful in catapulting these issues up the political agenda, and rightly so. In February this year, 22,000 people flocked to Trafalgar Square to hear Nelson Mandela give an inspiring address, urging world leaders to use 2005 to make poverty history. The campaign focused on three objectives: more and better aid, debt relief, and trade justice. Back in July, I marched in Edinburgh with almost 250,000 people, including, I see from the honourable members, some people in this room, just days before the G8 leaders met at Gleneagles. That summit brought some positive news on the first two objectives. On debt relief, the deal agreed means that every year $1 billion will be saved by the 18 countries eligible for debt relief. Many NGOs and campaigners have complained that this does not go far enough, as it represents only 10% of the debt that needs to be cancelled. And I do agree with that point of view, but I also think that it is a very welcome start and should be applauded. Likewise, the additional $50 billion a year in aid is a great achievement, and I'm glad to hear the Prime Minister talk of moving towards spending 0.7% of gross national income on aid. The UK is actually leading the way and should be proud of doing so among OECD countries on the percentage of GNI it spends on aid. However, I think it would be worth us all remembering that the commitment to spend 0.7% of GNI on aid is 35 years old. Now, call me impatient, but I think that's too slow. I was interested earlier this week to hear the Prime Minister's pledge to treble aid for trade on Monday the 14th of November at the speech that he made. And I wonder if the Minister in his remarks will clarify what effect that has on the UK reaching the target of 0.7%. Now, the third objective of Make Poverty History's campaign was trade justice. And in this House, more than 250 MPs have signed up to EDM 679, Making Poverty History Through Trade Justice. Over 8,000 members of the public came to lobby Parliament, lobbying over 300 MPs at the Trade Justice Lobby on the 2nd of November. And I'm sure many members here were lobbied by constituents on this issue. And then, of course, 2 days ago, in the speech that I just mentioned that the Prime Minister made on the issue of global trade, he set out his support for cutting trade barriers while implementing measures to help developing countries benefit from trade at their own pace. It's clear that this issue is regarded as highly important. I also think it's worth noting the particular interest of young people in these issues. Whether it was at the march in July, the April vigils, or the lobby just a couple of weeks ago, one thing that struck me was the number of young faces in the crowd. And it's just as well. One of my constituents, Sahir Hamid, was lucky enough to attend the World Youth Congress, which was held in Scotland over the summer. And there was a statistic that came out of that which I actually found quite shocking. 51% of the world's population is under 25. 51%. Given that statistic, I think it's just as well that young people are interested in these issues, because we're certainly not going to manage to solve them without the active engagement of young people around the world. Now, today I would like to focus my comments and questions on the difficulties that developing countries face with the current trade system, including trade barriers, the prospect of forced market liberalisation, and I'd also like to highlight the problems with TRIPS, the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. And I'll then turn to some potential solutions with reference to steps at the local and global level, including the forthcoming WTO talks in Hong Kong and beyond. Firstly, I would like to turn to the current problems with trade barriers. Production support and export subsidies in the developed world can have a devastating effect on developing countries. This is particularly apparent in the agriculture industry. When EU production is subsidised, and then there are additional subsidies on the exports, farmers in developing countries simply can't compete. Rich countries currently spend $279 billion on farm support. That is 3 times more than they spend on aid. And it's well acknowledged that a key sticking point, making it very difficult to look towards a positive outcome in next month's WTO negotiations, is the EU's intransigence on these protectionist agricultural policies. And though we know that France, in particular, is opposed to any concessions on this. So I would like to hear today from the Minister what discussions he, the Prime Minister and others within government have had with President Chirac regarding the reform of the Common Agricultural Policy and what tangible outcomes came from these discussions. It's not just agriculture. Tariffs in other countries, other industries such as textiles, also harm developing countries. For example, in 2001, Bangladesh exports generated $331 million in tariff revenue for the US Treasury. $331 million. And in that year, the net US aid to Bangladesh was just $87 million. Each year, the EU spends €4 million subsidising milk powder to Jamaica. The impact of dumping our excess milk powder in Jamaica has actually been a sharp drop in Jamaican milk production of 35% in the last 2 years. This makes it difficult for countries to continue running their own agriculture industries, producing their own food, which is obviously a more sustainable way forward. And in the EU, the average cow now receives $2.2 a day in support. That's more than the daily income of half the world's population. It's absolutely crazy. We have a situation where the EU is exporting sugar and beef at respectively 44% and 47% of their internal cost of production. No wonder sugar producers and cattle farmers in developing countries are losing out. Now, global trade has the potential to lift millions of people out of poverty. But liberalising markets too soon can stifle fledgling industries in developing countries. Christian Aid estimates that trade liberalisation has cost sub-Saharan Africa $272 billion over the last 20 years. That amount would be enough to pay off the region's debt and pay to vaccinate and educate every child in the region. Developing countries must be allowed the space to set their own timetable for liberalisation. Just looking at the example of rice. In 1995, the IMF forced the Haitian government to cut its rice tariffs from 35% to 3%. As a result of this, imports increased 150% in 9 years, and today in Haiti, 3 out of every 4 plates of rice is actually produced in the US. The impact of this is that local farmers' livelihoods have been devastated. In rice-growing areas, they're now the highest levels of malnutrition and poverty. At the same time, profits for Riceland Foods in Arkansas, the world's biggest rice mill, have risen by $123 million from 2002 to 2003, thanks in large part to a 50% increase in its exports, many of them to Haiti. You can see the inequality of this system. Of course...
Will the honourable member give way?
Certainly.
I would like to start by congratulating the honourable member for securing this debate at such an appropriate time, and I think that's really important for us. She has indeed made many valuable points, but I'm wondering if she's going to go on to say anything about European partnership agreements and whether she shares my worry that in their current form they really are causing a great deal of concern, and that I think most people would like to see the UK government take really strong action using its presidency of the EU to encourage other member states to rethink their approach on these agreements.
Jo Swinson.
Thank you very much, and I thank the Honourable Lady for her intervention, because I share many of her concerns with the economic partnership agreements. Obviously, trade with developing countries is not only governed by multilateral agreements, and these free trade deals which are negotiated between the EU and states within the African, Caribbean and Pacific group of countries often require countries to liberalise their markets substantially to benefit from trading with the EU. Now, it's true that the government has recently said that it has supported these ACP countries having more time to proceed with liberalisation, but I would agree that actually the conditionality should be removed from the agreements, and the developing countries should be free to choose if and when to liberalise. And I would also welcome if the Minister would perhaps make some remarks on this, in particular the UK's current position on EPAs, and if he could supply a list of the active partnerships. Now, I'd like to draw your attention to TRIPS, the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. After the introduction of TRIPS in 1995, patent rights had to be guaranteed protection by WTO member countries. Now, many of these countries wanted to use the formulas from patented drugs to treat their citizens suffering from a variety of diseases, from HIV, AIDS, malaria, TB. But many of the pharmaceuticals were actually seen as putting profits before people. Now, the WTO, after much discussion, did agree that TRIPS does not and should not prevent members from taking measures to protect public health. Well, the reality is quite different, because the only real way for many countries to get around this is to manufacture the drugs in their own country so they can provide for their own population. And this doesn't always run smoothly. Not all countries have the ability to do this. And the pharmaceuticals don't actually always agree that generic drug producers are complying with TRIPS. I'm sure that we'll all remember in 2001, there was the issue of 39 major pharmaceutical companies tried to prosecute the South African government for passing a law that allowed easy production and importation of generic drugs. Now, there was immense pressure from the South African government, from the European Parliament, and from 300,000 people around the world in 130 countries who signed a petition against the action. And this public international pressure actually forced the pharmaceuticals to back down. One of the companies, GlaxoSmithKline, even then granted a voluntary licence to a South African generics producer, allowing them to share the rights to their drugs, as long as 30% of the net sales went to an NGO fighting HIV and AIDS in South Africa, which they continue to do to this day. So, in many ways, a positive result. But let's remember, globally, only 15% of the estimated 6.5 million people who need this treatment were receiving it this year. Now, given the public health challenges facing many developing countries, not just from HIV and AIDS, but malaria, TB, and most likely at some point in the future a bird flu pandemic, it's clear that a review of TRIPS is urgently required. Protection must be in place to exempt areas which impact on the Millennium Development Goals and global disease control. And I think the example has demonstrated that the current provisions have proved to be inadequate. Now, global issues do require global solutions. But I believe that individuals can and do change their behaviour and do their bit to make trade fairer with developing countries. The Fair Trade Foundation, in accrediting products which are fairly traded, has played a role in enabling consumers to make informed choices. And the fact that sales of fair trade products have nearly doubled over the past 2 years to over 140 million shows the rising demand from consumers to take these issues into account when they're making their buying decisions. In my constituency of Eastern Bartonshire, there are many keen campaigners who have got together to take action at a local level. Setting up a steering group, they're working with local businesses and employers to try to become the first fair trade zone in Scotland. And I would be delighted if the Minister would agree to meet with myself and a group of my constituents who are working hard to promote fairer trade with developing countries to discuss these issues, and perhaps during his remarks he will indicate whether he's willing to do this. I'd like to share with you a story from my constituency which I think sums up many of the issues involved. In my constituency there's a local gift and tea shop called the Coach House, which is run on a not-for-profit basis to fund charitable projects at home and abroad. 20 years ago, a lady called Angela Gomez came from Bangladesh to the Coach House. She represented 4,000 destitute women who made beautiful embroidery. When she was offered a grant for her organisation, she said, "I don't want handouts. I want you to sell our women's products. That's what gives them their dignity." Angela Gomez was spot on. The women she represented didn't have much, they were destitute. But by being able to work their trade and then have it sold abroad, they had dignity, and it also helped to lift them out of poverty. And that's why, of the 3 aims of the Make Poverty History campaign, I believe the trade justice part is the most important. Trade really can help to lift people out of poverty, and it presents a great potential opportunity for developing countries. But the balance needs to be evened up. between the rich and powerful developed world and the developing countries on the other hand. So the talks next month in Hong Kong really are vital, and the discussions that will follow in 2006 to secure the details of the Doha round in time to take advantage of the US fast-track agreement. Now, we've all read the reports of the recent difficulties with the pre-negotiations, and I wonder if the Minister will be able to actually talk a little bit also about how the government sees the procedures of the WTO, the institutional setup, and how effective it is in actually producing outcomes from talks which can favour poorer countries, given the experience of the rounds before in Cancun and Seattle. Now, in conclusion, the UK should be in a strong position to influence events. With the presidency of the EU, and when the Trade Commissioner is not only a UK nominee to the Commission, but, as is well documented, a close personal friend of the Prime Minister, we should be in a position to use this influence to get a good outcome from Hong Kong. And I would like to know what discussions the Minister has had, and the Prime Minister and other members in government, with Commissioner Mandelson regarding the Doha round in Hong Kong next month, and how he views the potential outcomes and what he believes can actually be achieved, what is realistic to come out from those talks. 2005 has represented a fantastic opportunity to make progress on poverty and trade justice. I hope it will not be remembered as a missed opportunity. Now, this week the Prime Minister has given encouragement to many with his comments on the issue of trade in developing countries. I hope that he, the Minister, and all those involved in the WTO negotiations will remember the words of Nelson Mandela earlier this year, when he called on world leaders to recognise that the world is hungry for action, not words. Thank you.